She stood in the blazing Wyoming sun, with an iron collar welded around her neck, sold for the third time like livestock. At 21 years old, Beatrice Parker had already survived horrors that would have destroyed most people. Then a stranger paid $100 for her, more money than most cowboys saw in 3 months. She braced herself for the worst, because men with kind eyes had fooled her before. But this man did something no one had ever done. He cut the collar off her neck. He buried it in the ground like poison. And then he handed her a loaded gun and said, "Keep this under your pillow. If I ever make you feel unsafe, use it on me." Was this man different from all the others? Or was this just another trap dressed up in kindness? What happened next would test everything she believed about trust, about men, and about her own broken heart. This is a love story, but not the kind you expect. This is about a woman who learned to save herself. This story proves that your past does not define your future. True love is not about rescue. It's about partnership, patience, and the courage to let someone earn your trust one day at a time. If you believe that broken people can build beautiful lives, drop a comment below. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to remember that healing is possible, and that the right person will wait as long as it takes. That iron collar felt heavy around her neck, its dull shine lost in the blistering Wyoming sun. And Beatrice Parker couldn't help but wonder if she'd die in it, just like the animal they'd made her out to be. There she stood, smack in the middle of Fort Bridger's dusty Main Street in July of 1872, being sold off like a head of cattle for the third time in 2 years. Her wrists were tied with a rough rope that had chafed her skin clean off. The last man to own her, a railroad tycoon named Thaddeus Crane, had locked that collar on her 6 months back when she tried to escape, reminding her she was just property and nothing more. Now, a heart attack had claimed Mr. Crane, and his estate was selling off everything he had, and that included the young woman he'd won in a San Francisco gambling house to clear a debt. Beatrice was only 21 years old, but the cold look in her blue eyes could make her seem like she'd seen 100 lifetimes. Her deep auburn hair was a tangled, limp mess that fell past her shoulders, and her simple cotton dress was stained and ripped at the bottom. But the collar, that was the worst of it. It was a cold, constant weight that told her she had no control over her own life, that men like Crane could do as they pleased with women who had no family, no one to protect them, and no rights under the law. She was born to a woman of the night in Sacramento who passed when Beatrice was 14, leaving her all alone in a world that chewed up and spit out young women like her. Some crooked saloon keeper insisted she owed him for her mother's tabs. After that, Beatrice's life just became one sale after another, each one worse than the one before. The auctioneer, a fat man with teeth stained brown from tobacco, started listing her good points like she was a horse he was selling. She had a strong back, knew her way around a kitchen, and was young enough to have babies. He hollered, "We will start the bidding at $50. Beatrice kept her gaze fixed on the dirt, refusing to make eye contact with the men gathering around her. She had learned the hard way that fighting back only made things worse. But deep down, a fire of pure rage was burning hot. She would sooner be dead than belong to another man who believed his money gave him the right to own her, body and soul. $50, a merchant with greedy eyes called out. 60, a rancher shot back, a man whose hands looked like they were used to crushing things. Beatrice felt her stomach clench. She tried to figure her odds of making a run for it, but with her hands tied and that collar marking her as property, she knew she wouldn't get 10 feet before they dragged her back. The territory had laws about runaways, and none of them were on her side. $100. That voice was sharp and clear, cutting through the other bids like a good knife. It was deep, steady, and felt different from the others. The crowd moved aside, and that's when Beatrice laid eyes on him. He was a tall fella, maybe 26 or 27, with skin tanned by the sun and dark brown hair that was getting a little long. He was dressed like a working cowboy in dusty denim pants, a simple shirt with the sleeves rolled up, scuffed leather boots, and a hat that had seen its share of hard days. But what really got her were his eyes. They were a clear hazel, and he looked right at her face, not at her figure, not at the collar, but at her, like he saw a real person standing there. The auctioneer's face lit up with dollar signs. $100 from Ethan Barrett. Do I hear 110? The rancher, who'd bid 60, just shook his head and walked off. The merchant looked mad but kept his mouth shut. $100 was a heap of money back in 1872, more than most cowboys saw in 3 months. Going once, going twice, sold to Ethan Barrett for $100. Beatrice felt another piece of her spirit just crumble. It didn't matter. If this man had kind eyes. Men with kind eyes could turn into monsters the second they had you alone. She'd learned that lesson more times than she could count. Ethan walked up and laid out the money in gold coins, which the auctioneer snatched up like a hungry dog. Then Ethan turned to Beatrice and pulled a knife from his belt. She flinched, her whole body bracing for a fight. But he didn't grab her. Instead, he reached out and gently sliced through the ropes around her wrists. "You are going to bleed if we do not get those cleaned up," he said in a low voice, looking at the raw, open sores the rope had left behind. His voice was softer than she could have imagined. Beatrice just stared at him, completely confused. Every other man who had bought her had made his power over her clear right away, had spelled out her purpose, and had taken what he paid for without delay. But this Ethan Barrett just stood there with his knife, waiting for something she couldn't figure out. "Can you walk?" he asked. She gave a small nod, afraid to use her voice. "My horse is over at the livery. We have got a bit of a ride ahead of us." As they walked down the main street of Fort Bridger, Beatrice felt every single stare on that collar around her neck. It scraped against her skin with each step, a cold circle of metal that announced to the world what she was. Women looked at her with either pity or disgust, and the men looked with either curiosity or scorn. She kept her eyes glued to the ground, just following the dust kicked up by Ethan's boots. At the livery stable, he had 2 horses already saddled up, a big chestnut gelding for himself and a smaller bay mare. He nodded toward the mare. "You can ride." "Yes," Beatrice managed to say, her voice scratchy from not being used. Crane had forbidden her to speak unless he spoke to her first. "Good. It is about 15 miles to my ranch. We ought to get there before it gets dark." He gave her a hand up onto the saddle, his touch brief and businesslike, before he swung himself onto his own horse. They rode out of Fort Bridger, heading to the northeast, and Beatrice did her best to memorize every landmark just in case she had to run. The Wyoming country just rolled on forever in every direction, with hills covered in sagebrush and wild grass, and mountains standing tall in the distance like guards. The sky was so big it made her feel small, yet it also gave her a strange sense of freedom she had not known for years. They rode on without a word for what felt like an eternity. Beatrice's thoughts were running wild, each one more frightening than the one before. It occurred to her that Ethan Barrett might not want to claim her in front of everyone. He could be taking her someplace far off where nobody could hear her cry for help. He might be the kind of man who acts gentle right before he reveals his true colors. At last, as the sun began to dip low in the west, painting the sky with strokes of orange and pink, Ethan reined his horse to a slow walk. Beatrice did the same, every muscle in her body wound tight with worry. "That thing around your neck," Ethan said, not even turning to look at her. "Was it Crane who put that on you?" Beatrice's hand flew to her throat without a thought. "Yes." "Does it have a lock?" "No, it is welded shut." Ethan fell silent for a long moment, and she could see the muscle in his jaw clench. "When we make it to the ranch, I'm going to take that off. I am telling you this now so you will not be scared when you see me coming at you with a pair of metal cutters." Beatrice felt the air catch in her lungs. "Why?" "Because a human being should not be collared like an animal." His voice was firm with an anger she knew was not meant for her. "Because what Crane did was plain wrong, and I will not allow it on my property." She had no idea how to answer him. Every word that came to her mind felt either too small or too risky. So she stayed quiet, and they rode on as the sun sank even lower, and a cool breeze picked up. They came over a small hill and saw Ethan's ranch below them. It was a simple place, with a solid-looking log cabin, a barn, and a corral holding a few horses. Good grazing land stretched all the way to a creek lined with big cottonwood trees. It wasn't a fancy place, but it looked cared for and honest. The kind of place a man builds with his own two hands, not one he's given. They got down from their horses in front of the barn, and Ethan led both animals inside to be unsaddled and brushed. Beatrice just stood there feeling out of place and unsure of what she was supposed to do. In all her other situations, the rules were made painfully clear right from the start. Here, she didn't have a clue what was going on. "You must be hungry," Ethan said as he came out of the barn. "There is food inside the cabin. Go on in and help yourself to whatever you find. I will be in after a bit." Beatrice walked toward the cabin slowly, half thinking it was some kind of trick. But the door wasn't locked. Inside was just one big room with a stone fireplace, a bed over in the corner, a table with a couple of chairs, shelves full of supplies, and a little kitchen area with a cast-iron stove. Everything was neat and tidy, the home of a man who looked after his things. She saw there was only one bed, and that old familiar fear twisted in her gut. She found some bread, cheese, and dried meat on the shelves, and a jar of preserved peaches that made her mouth water. She hadn't eaten anything since the day before, and her hands were trembling as she cut herself some bread and cheese. She was still eating when Ethan walked in. He was carrying a pair of big metal cutters and a small leather bag. "Let me see that collar," he said, putting his tools down on the table. Beatrice froze, the food turning to dust in her mouth. Her body went stiff as a board. Every part of her wanted to bolt, but there wasn't anywhere to go. She had learned a long, long time ago that running just made the punishment that followed even worse. Ethan must have seen the pure terror in her eyes because he held up his hands with his palms facing her. "I am just going to cut it off. That is it. I swear I am not going to hurt you." "Men always say that," Beatrice whispered. He looked at her for a long, hard second, and she saw a flash of something that looked like pain in his eyes. "I know. And I know you do not have a single reason to trust me, but I am asking you to please let me do this one thing. After that, if you still want to leave, I will give you some money and a horse, and you can go anywhere you want. But I have got to get that damned collar off your neck." Beatrice didn't believe a word he said about letting her go, but she also knew she didn't really have a choice. Slowly, she walked over to him and lifted her chin, showing him the collar. Her heart was beating so fast and hard she thought it was going to break right through her ribs. Ethan brought the metal cutters up, his hands perfectly steady. "This might pinch just a little, but I will be as fast as I can. Just hold still now." The crack of metal cutting through metal was loud in the quiet cabin. Beatrice felt a sharp pressure on her throat. It was uncomfortable, but it didn't hurt, model. With a sharp snap, the collar broke apart in two pieces and fell onto the table with a heavy clang. The sudden lack of weight on her neck was so startling that she gasped, her hand shooting up to feel the bare skin there. "That is that," Ethan said in a low voice. He looked at the severed iron with nothing but disgust. "You wait right here." He stepped outside, and Beatrice stood frozen in place, her fingers tracing the deep groove the collar had worn into her skin. She heard the rhythmic scrape of a shovel in the dirt. When she moved to the doorway, she could see Ethan in the dimming light, digging a deep hole near the boundary of his land. He dropped the two halves of the collar in and covered them up, stamping the dirt down hard as though he were putting away some terrible evil that should never see the light of day again. When he came back in, his hands were caked with dirt and his face was grim. "It is done," he said. "You will never wear a thing like that again." Beatrice felt the sting of tears in her eyes and turned her head away so he would not notice. She had forced herself to stop crying years back, knowing that tears only made cruel men feel stronger. But the simple act of him destroying that collar, of putting it deep into the earth, had put a crack in the armor around her heart. "Thank you," she said, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Ethan washed his hands in a water bucket near the door. "You ought to finish your food. Then you and I need to have a talk." Beatrice went back to the table, but her desire to eat had completely disappeared. She watched Ethan with weary eyes as he sat across from her. His big build made the wooden chair look like it belonged to a child. He folded his hands on the table and looked directly at her. "Here is the situation," he said. "I bought you today because I could not stand by and watch you be sold to men who were fixing to treat you horribly. I know that does not make me a hero. I still took part in a system that treats people like livestock, and I am not proud of it. But what is done, and now we have to decide what happens next." Beatrice remained silent, just waiting for the other shoe to drop. "You can leave if you want to," Ethan went on. "I meant what I said. I will give you a horse, money, and supplies, and you can ride to California or head back east, or anywhere you think you can find a decent life. But I am going to be honest with you. This is a tough country for a woman traveling alone. You know that better than I do." "What is the other option?" Beatrice asked, her voice flat and empty. "You can stay here," he replied. "I need help to keep this ranch going. The work is hard and the pay is not much. But you would have a roof over your head, food on the table, and I give you my solemn word I will never touch you in any way you do not welcome. You would be a hired hand, not a slave. Not property, but a person earning a wage." Beatrice looked hard at his face, searching for the lie. Men always lied about what they wanted, but Ethan's hazel eyes were steady and clear, and the set of his jaw seemed to speak of an honest man. She wanted so badly to believe him, but believing was a risk she could not afford to take. "What kind of work?" she asked carefully. "Cooking, washing clothes, mending things, and helping with the animals when I need it. General ranch chores. It is not easy, but it is honest work." "And if I stay, where do I sleep?" Ethan pointed to the cot in the corner. "You take the bed. I will sleep in the barn." "That does not make any sense. This is your house." "And you are a woman who has been through hell and deserves to feel safe," he said. "The barn is just fine. I have slept in far worse places." Beatrice felt a strange stirring in her chest, something that might have been hope if she had not learned to stamp out that feeling a long time ago. "How do I know you will not just change your mind? How do I know you will not walk in here one night and take what you believe you paid for?" Ethan reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small revolver, and set it on the table between them. "You keep this under your pillow. If I ever do a single thing that makes you feel unsafe, you use it on me. I would rather be dead than become the kind of man that would force himself on a woman." Beatrice stared at the weapon. It had to be a test. Surely no man would hand a loaded gun to a woman he had just purchased unless he was trying to prove a point. But what if it was not loaded? What if this was all just a clever trick to make her let her guard down? As if he had read her thoughts, Ethan picked up the revolver, swung the cylinder open to show her it was full, then snapped it shut and set it back down. "It is real, and it is yours. It is for your protection, not to threaten you." The sun was completely gone now, and the cabin was getting dark. Ethan got up and lit an oil lamp, which cast a warm glow on the rough-hewn walls. "You do not have to decide tonight. Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning." He grabbed a blanket out of a chest and walked to the door. "Bolt this after me. Do not open it for anyone, and that includes me, unless you feel completely safe to do so." And then he left, leaving Beatrice alone in the cabin with a loaded gun and more questions than she had answers. She heard his footsteps cross the yard to the barn, and then the creak of the barn door opening and closing. Then there was silence, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. With a trembling hand, Beatrice picked up the revolver. It was heavier than she imagined, cold and solid and real. She checked the cylinder again, saw that it was loaded, and then held it in her lap as she sat in that wooden chair, staring at the bolted door. She did not trust Ethan Barrett. She could not trust him, not yet. But he had cut off her collar. He had buried it deep in the ground. And that one action had given her something she had not felt in 2 years. The smallest possibility that not all men were monsters. She did not sleep in the bed that night. She sat in the chair, with the gun on her lap, watching the door, waiting for him to come back and show his true self. But the door never opened. The night passed by slowly, and as the first gray light of dawn appeared in the window, Beatrice finally let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, Ethan Barrett had meant everything he said. When daylight finally came, Beatrice heard noises from the barn, the lowing of cattle, the whinny of a horse, the general sounds of a ranch waking up. She stood up stiffly, her whole body aching from sitting in the chair all night, and went to a small mirror hanging on the wall. The face that looked back at her was thin and hollow-eyed, but the angry red mark around her neck from the collar was already starting to fade. She touched it gently, amazed once more at the absence of that horrible weight. A knock on the door made her jump. "Miss Parker, I'm going to leave some water by the door for you to wash with. Take your time. I will be working with the horses if you need anything." Beatrice waited until she heard his footsteps walk away before she unbolted the door. A bucket of clean water sat outside, still cool from the well, along with a bar of soap. She brought them inside and bolted the door again. Then she took off the filthy dress she had been wearing and washed herself from head to toe for the first time in weeks. The soap smelled strong and clean, like lye and lavender. She scrubbed away all the dirt and grime, wishing she could wash away the memories that easily. She had no other clothes, so she had to put the same dress back on. But at least her skin felt clean. She braided her hair to get it out of her face and tried to make herself look presentable. Then she tucked the revolver into the pocket of her dress, feeling its solid weight against her hip like a promise, and went outside to find Ethan. He was in the corral, working with a young horse. He was patient and gentle, letting the animal approach him instead of forcing it to obey. Beatrice watched him from the fence, studying him. He moved with a quiet confidence, not with arrogance. And when the horse finally allowed him to touch its neck, he rewarded it with soft words and a piece of an apple from his pocket. "You are good with horses," Beatrice said. Ethan looked up, his face showing his surprise that she had come outside. "Horses are honest," he said. "Treat them right, and they will give you everything they have. Treat them wrong, and they will never trust you. There is a purity in that. Is that why you treat people the same way?" He smiled, just a little, the first time she had seen him smile. It changed his entire face, making him look younger and less worn by the world. "I try to. I do not always get it right, but I try." Beatrice climbed through the fence and approached him slowly, the same way Ethan had approached the horse. "I have decided to stay for now, but some things need to be clear." "All right. I will do the work you give me, and you will pay me wages, real wages that I can save. You will not touch me. You will not come into the cabin without knocking first. And if you break any of those rules, I will leave, or I will use this." She patted the pocket where the gun rested. "Agreed," Ethan said. He held out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Beatrice looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Shaking hands was something partners did, something equals did. She could not remember the last time someone had offered to shake her hand as if she were a real person. Slowly, she reached out and took his hand. His grip was warm and calloused and firm without being painful. "Deal," she said. And so Beatrice Parker began a new life at the Barrett Ranch. The work was hard, just as Ethan had said it would be. Promised. She was up before the sun to get breakfast going, spending long hours over that wood stove. She figured out how to bake bread in the heavy iron pot, and how to put up vegetables from the little garden out behind the house. She washed their clothes down at the creek, scrubbing them on the rocks until her hands were chapped and raw. then strung them up to dry on a line tied between two big cottonwood trees. By the light of an oil lamp, she'd patch up torn shirts and pants, teaching herself to make the tiniest, neatest stitches that could stand up to a hard day's work. But it was good, honest labor, and that made all the difference in the world. When Ethan needed something done, he would ask, not order. And in those first weeks when she was still learning and made plenty of mistakes, he would show her the right way with patience, never with a harsh word. And he was a man of his word. He never laid a hand on her. The only time they touched was when their hands might brush by accident as they passed dishes at supper. And he would always apologize right quick. He made his bed out in the barn, even as the nights started to get a chill, and Beatrice knew he would be a whole lot warmer in the house. Sometimes, in the quiet hours just before dawn, she could hear him stirring about, already out there feeding the livestock. He worked himself to the bone day in and day out. She couldn't help but wonder what pushed him so hard. What made a man spend his last hard-earned dollar to buy a woman just to give her freedom? One evening, late in August, after they had cleaned up from supper, they sat on the porch and watched the first stars pop out. Beatrice finally found the courage to ask him, "Why did you do it? Why did you buy me?" Ethan stayed quiet for such a long time that she figured he was not going to answer at all. Then he finally spoke. "I had a sister. Her name was Emily. She was 2 years younger than me, sharp as a tack, pretty as a picture, and just full of life. When I was 20 and she was 18, our folks died from the cholera. We didn't have a penny to our name and no kin to take us in. I tried my best to find work, to keep food on the table, but it just was not enough. Emily took a job down at a saloon to help us get by, and I reckoned it would be all right. I thought I could look out for her." His voice got gravelly then. "I was wrong. The fellow who owned the saloon started making demands. Said she owed him for her room and board. Before I even knew what was happening, he had sold her contract to some man on his way to San Francisco. I tried to put a stop to it. I got into it with 3 of the owner's hired men, and they beat me so bad I was out cold for 2 whole days. By the time I could get back on my feet, Emily was long gone. I never did see her again." Beatrice felt hot tears well up in her eyes. "What happened to her?" "I don't know," he said. "I looked for 5 years. I went all the way to San Francisco, asked around everywhere, chased down every little rumor. But she just vanished into that world where women disappear, and nobody much cares to go looking for them. I reckon she's probably gone now. And I reckon she died thinking I left her high and dry when she needed me most." "That was not your fault," Beatrice said, her voice soft. "Maybe not. But I could not save her. So when I saw you standing on that street wearing a collar like you were some kind of animal, I saw Emily, and I knew I could not just walk on by. I had to at least try to save one person, even if I was too late for my own sister." They just sat there in the quiet for a good long while after that. 2 folks who had been through the ringer, just watching the stars turn slowly across that big Wyoming sky. Beatrice felt something change inside her, a small shift in how she saw things. Ethan Barrett was not trying to be some white knight. He was just trying to make up for a failure that was never his to begin with, trying to find some meaning in a world that had taken away someone he loved. "I am so sorry about Emily," Beatrice finally said. "I am sorry for whatever happened that made you so scared to trust anybody." It was not just one thing, she heard herself say. It was 1,000 little things. "You do not have to tell me," he said. "Not unless you want to." But to her own surprise, Beatrice found that she did want to tell him. So she did, sitting there in the growing dark where she could not see his face well enough to read the judgment in it. She told him about her mother passing, about the saloon owner who made up debts she did not owe, and about being sold that first time to a merchant who used her something awful and then just got tired of her. She told him about the second man, a gambler who had won her in a card game and kept her locked away in a room for 6 whole months. And she told him about Thaddeus Crane, who looked like a gentleman on the outside, but was the cruelest one of them all, a man who got as much pleasure from breaking her spirit as he did from using her body. When she was done, her voice was just a whisper and her hands were trembling. But Ethan did not look at her with pity, and he sure did not look at her with disgust. He looked at her with a kind of respect, like she had just told him something brave instead of something shameful. "You survived," he said, plain and simple. "That takes a kind of strength most folks just do not have. Some days I am not so sure it was worth surviving. But you are here," he said. "You are free of that collar, and tomorrow morning you get to decide what kind of life you want to build. That has got to be worth something, does it not?" Beatrice thought about his words as she went inside to her room that night. For the first time, and longer than she could remember, she laid down in the bed instead of keeping watch in the chair. She still kept the pistol tucked under her pillow, but she let herself shut her eyes and drift off into something that felt almost like real sleep. The weeks rolled into months, and a comfortable rhythm grew between Beatrice and Ethan. They worked together like they had been doing it for years, knowing what the other needed without a word, splitting up the chores without having to talk about it. She learned the patterns of ranch life, how the seasons told you what work needed doing, how the land itself needed tending and care. He taught her how to be a better rider, how to shoot a rifle straight, and how to track a deer through the sagebrush. She taught him that food could be more than just something to fill your belly, making him meals that made him close his eyes and savor every bite. They would talk in the evenings, sharing bits and pieces of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Beatrice learned that Ethan had been a soldier for a short spell during the war, fighting for the Union side until a bad leg wound sent him packing. He had taken his army pay and every cent he had saved over the years to buy this piece of land, building the whole place with his own 2 hands. His dream was a simple one: to have a ranch big enough to raise a family, to live an honest life, and to never be beholden to any man. Beatrice felt herself start to soften towards him, and it scared her to death. She started noticing things she had taught herself to ignore for years. The way his eyes crinkled up at the corners when he smiled, the sheer strength in his hands as he worked, the low, gentle tone of his voice when he spoke to the animals. She noticed how he always made sure she had her plate first at supper, and how sometimes he would leave a little bunch of wildflowers on the porch without a word. He respected every line she had drawn without ever making her feel like a burden. She noticed all of it, and she tried with all her might not to let it mean anything. But that feeling of caring just crept up on her, as quiet and steady as the seasons changing. By September, when the air turned crisp and the aspen trees on the faraway mountains blazed gold, Beatrice had to finally admit to herself that she was starting to have feelings for Ethan Barrett. It was a terrifying thought. Every man she had ever given an ounce of trust to had thrown it back in her face. But Ethan just kept on being exactly who he said he was: honest, kind, patient, and expecting nothing from her but the work they had agreed on. One evening in early October, a big storm blew in out of nowhere, the way storms do out in Wyoming. The temperature dropped a good 20 degrees in an hour, and a cold rain started whipping across the ranch. Beatrice was inside the cabin getting supper ready when a bolt of lightning struck so close it made the windows rattle. She glanced outside and saw Ethan was in the barn, but she knew for a fact that the barn roof leaked in half a dozen places. He would be soaked through and freezing all night long. In that moment, she made up her mind. She threw open the door, ran out into the downpour, and was drenched in an instant on her way to the barn. Ethan looked up surprised when she came bursting in with water streaming from her hair and clothes. "What are you doing out here?" he asked. "You're going to catch your death." "So are you," she shot back. "That roof leaks like a sieve, and it is going to be near freezing tonight. You need to come inside." "Beatrice, we talked about this. You need your space." "What I need," she said, "is for you not to die of pneumonia, because you are too stubborn to come in out of the rain. I am not a child, Ethan. I can handle you sleeping on the floor by the fire without falling to pieces." He looked like he was about to argue, but another loud crack of lightning pretty much made the decision for him. They ran back to the cabin together, and as soon as they were inside, Beatrice tossed him a dry blanket. "Get out of those wet clothes before you freeze solid. I will turn around." She kept herself busy at the stove, stirring the stew she was making, and listened to the sound of him changing. When she turned back, he was wrapped up in the blanket, and his wet things were hanging by the fireplace to dry. His hair was dripping wet, and he looked younger than she had ever seen him, with a kind of vulnerability she was not used to. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. They ate their dinner in a silence that was not exactly comfortable, but it was not uncomfortable either. It was just filled with something that neither one of them had a name for. Outside, the storm howled and threw rain against the cabin, but inside it was warm and dry. It was filled with a kind of quiet, homey feeling that Beatrice had never known in her whole life. This, she realized, this is what safety felt like. This was what it meant to share a room with a man who had no intention of ever hurting you. After they ate, Ethan laid down on the floor near the hearth, using his saddle as a pillow. Beatrice lay down in the bed. She lay there watching the firelight dance across the ceiling and listening to the steady rhythm of rain on the roof. Sleep was what she needed, but her mind just would not be still. She could not stop thinking about the man on the floor, about every single way he had shown himself to be different from any man she had ever known. "Ethan," she finally said into the quiet room. "Yes? Why is it you never married?" He was silent for a good long while. "I came mighty close one time, before the war. A girl named Sarah lived on the next farm over. But when I got back, all wounded, she had already married somebody else. It made me angry for a bit, but looking back now, I reckon she did me a favor. We wanted different things out of life. She wanted to be comfortable and safe. I was looking for something else, though I could not have told you what it was back then. What do you want now? A partner, I suppose. Someone to build a life with, not a person to look after or tell what to do. Somebody who chooses to be there, not someone who has to be there because of how folks think or because they have no money. Maybe that is too much to ask for." Beatrice's heart started pounding in her chest. "I do not think that is asking for too much at all." She heard him move around on the floor. "What is it you want, Beatrice?" It was the first time he had ever asked her that, and she knew in that moment that nobody had ever cared enough to ask what she wanted before. "I want to never belong to anyone again. I want to make my own decisions, and I want," she paused, scared to speak the words out loud. "I want to know how it feels to be with a man because I want to be, not because I have nowhere else to go." "That makes good sense," Ethan said, and she could hear in his voice that he truly understood. "You deserve that. You deserve every bit of that." The storm finally wore itself out through the night, and when the sun came up, the whole world looked clean and new. Ethan went back to sleeping out in the barn, but there was a change between them now. The air felt thick with what could be, and Beatrice found herself watching him more and more, wondering what it might be like to touch him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She tried her best to shove those thoughts away. She was not ready for that. She might never be. The hurt done to her went down too deep, and the scars felt like they would last forever. But the thoughts kept returning, as sure as the seasons change. One afternoon in late October, 3 men came riding up to the Barrett Ranch, right around sunset. Beatrice was out hanging laundry when she spotted them coming, and something in the way they carried themselves made her hand go right to the revolver she had started keeping in her apron pocket. She walked over fast to where Ethan was mending a fence post. "We have got company," she told him in a low voice. "And they do not look like the friendly kind." Ethan stood up straight, his whole face turning serious. "Get in the house and bar the door. Do not you come out for any reason unless I call for you. Ethan, please. Beatrice, I need you to trust me in this." She wanted to argue something fierce, but the look he gave her made her stop. She went on inside, but stood right by the window where she could see and hear everything going on. Her hand tightened around the revolver, and she checked to make sure it was loaded and ready. The 3 men got down from their horses in the yard. They were rough-looking fellas, the type of drifters who make their living doing things they should not. The one out front, a man with a scarred-up face and mean-looking eyes, scanned the ranch like he was sizing up what he could steal. "You must be Ethan Barrett," the scarred man said. "I am. What can I do for y'all? We heard you bought a woman a few months back over in Fort Bridger. A woman with dark hair wearing a collar, is that right?" A cold dread washed over Beatrice. They were here for her. Somehow someone had sent them to take back what they figured was stolen property. "I bought a woman's contract, yes," Ethan said, choosing his words with care. "What business is that of yours?" Thaddeus Crane's nephew seems to think. "You might have used his uncle's passing to get a hold of property that rightly belonged to the family. He wants the woman brought back. Says he will give you what you paid plus $20 for your trouble. The woman is not for sale." "That is not a smart answer, friend. Jackson Crane is not a man you want to get on the wrong side of. I do not give a damn who Jackson Crane is. The woman is staying right here." The scarred man's hand started to move toward his gun. "Maybe you did not hear me clear enough. This ain't a discussion." Ethan's body shifted just a little, and Beatrice saw it was the way a man stands when he is ready for a fight. "Get off my land, now. We will be leaving when we get what we came for." Everything happened in the blink of an eye after that. The scarred man pulled his gun, but Ethan was quicker. His shot hit the man square in the shoulder, spinning him clean around. The other two men reached for their guns, and Beatrice stopped thinking. She flung the door wide open and fired 2 shots, her bullets kicking up dirt right at the second man's boots, making him jump back. "The next one goes through your chest," she hollered, amazed at how steady her own voice sounded. "Drop your guns and ride on out of here, or I swear to you I will kill you." The 2 men who were not hurt looked at each other, then at the scarred one holding his bleeding shoulder, then back at Beatrice standing in the doorway with that smoking revolver. Whatever they thought was going to happen, this surely was not it. They dropped their guns, dragged their wounded partner onto his horse, and rode off at a full gallop, vanishing into the growing twilight. Beatrice just stood there, the revolver now shaking in her hands that the danger was over. Ethan came over and gently took the gun from her, put the safety on, and handed it back. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so. Are you?" "Yes. Thank you for not staying inside like I told you to. I could not let them take me, and I could not stand by and let them hurt you." Ethan looked at her with an expression she just could not figure out. "We ought to get ready in case they decide to come back with more men. Jackson Crane has got money and people who listen to him. This is not over." But those men did not come back that night or the next day or the day after that either. A week went by, and Ethan rode into Fort Bridger, and he returned with some news. Jackson Crane had been put under arrest for fraud and for stealing money. It turned out his uncle's whole estate was buried in debt and legal messes, and Crane had been trying to sell off whatever he could, including people he thought of as property, just to pay the folks he owed. But a federal marshal had been looking into him, and his attempt to get Beatrice back had given that marshal all the proof he needed to make an arrest. "It is over," Ethan told Beatrice. "Nobody is coming to get you. You are free, legally and in every other way. Crane's claim on you was never worth the paper it was written on. What his uncle did was kidnapping and holding you against your will. The law just never bothered to do anything about it until there was money on the line." Beatrice sat down hard, feeling like the whole world had just tilted on its side. "So I could just walk away right now and nobody could do a thing to stop me. That is right. You could go anywhere you want, be anyone you want. The world is wide open for you." She looked around the little cabin, at the simple life she had started to build there these last 4 months. It was not the kind of life she would have picked for herself if she had been given the chance at 18 or 20. But now, at 21, after surviving things that would have shattered most anybody, this life felt like a treasure. This small cabin, all this hard work, this quiet friendship with a man who had shown he was worth her trust, all of it had a value she could never have dreamed of back when she stood on a street in Fort Bridger wearing that collar. "What if I do not want to leave?" she asked in a small voice. Ethan looked right at her, and the hope she saw in his eyes was so strong it was almost hard to look at. Then you could stay, not as someone who works for me anymore, but as a partner, as someone building this ranch right alongside me. Ethan, I do not know if I can be the person you need. I am broken in places I do not think I will ever be able to mend. He walked across the room and knelt down in front of her. He did not touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel his warmth. You are not broken. You are scarred. But scars just prove you are tougher than whatever tried to hurt you. And I am not asking you to be anyone but who you are right now. I am not asking you to be ready for anything you are not ready for. I am just asking if you would think about staying, building something with me here, and just seeing where things might go between us. Beatrice looked into his hazel eyes and saw no demands, no expecting anything back, just plain, honest caring and all the patience in the world. She thought about that collar buried deep in the Wyoming ground. She thought about the gun she kept under her pillow that she had never once had to think about using against him. She thought about the way he said her name, like it was something precious. I would like to stay, she said. But we have to go slow. I need to do this slowly. As slow as you need, Ethan promised. I have waited this long. I can surely wait some more. The winter of 1872 came in hard, with snow piled up high and the temperatures dropping way below zero. Beatrice and Ethan worked side by side to keep the ranch going, feeding the stock, breaking up ice on the water troughs, and keeping the little cabin warm. They fell into a daily rhythm that was simple and comfortable, and bit by bit, ever so slowly, Beatrice started to let him get a little closer. She would let him hold her hand sometimes while they sat by the fire in the evening. She would lean her shoulder against his. She let herself truly enjoy the sound of his laugh and the warmth in his smile. And then one night in January, when the cold was so bitter that even the barn was not fit for sleeping, she asked him to sleep inside the cabin, without any talk of storms or needing to. You can have the bed, she offered. I will just sleep in the chair. We could share it, Ethan said gently. Just for sleeping. Nothing more. I can stay on top of the covers if that would make you feel better. Well, it is getting cold, and there is not a lick of sense in both of us freezing when that bed has plenty of room for two folks. It was a chance, she knew. Every bone in Beatrice's body was screaming that this was how trouble started, how lines got blurred, how bad things came to pass. But she was just plain tired of being scared. She was worn out from letting what was behind her decide what was in front of her, and more than anything else, she trusted Ethan Barrett. All right, she said. They lay down on that bed that night with a respectable distance between them, both still in their day clothes. Beatrice was wound so tight she felt like she might just snap in two. But Ethan was a man of his word. He lay perfectly still, his breath coming soft and steady, and he never made a single move toward her. And after a while, as the hours ticked by and the quiet stayed safe, Beatrice felt some of the stiffness leave her. She shifted a little closer, just an inch or two, and could feel the warmth coming off of him. She let her hand come to rest on the quilt near his, their fingers close enough to feel the space between them. Is this okay? She whispered. This is perfect, Ethan whispered right back. And it truly was perfect, in a way Beatrice had never known. This quiet closeness without any expectation. Just sharing a space without any demands being made. She fell asleep just like that, near enough to touch but not touching, feeling safe enough to finally rest. After that night, they shared the bed often, and Beatrice found herself mending in places she thought were broken for good. A simple touch became something to welcome instead of just to get through. Being near someone became something she could want instead of fear. And slowly, carefully, she started to imagine a life where being close with someone was not just something to be endured, but something to be wished for. Spring came to Wyoming in a burst of wildflowers and fresh green grass, and the whole ranch felt like it was waking up from a long winter slumber. Beatrice put in a bigger garden patch, dropping seeds for vegetables and herbs into the soil, working the dirt with her bare hands and feeling like she was part of the land in a way she never had before. Ethan bought more cattle, growing the herd, and he would talk about his plans for the future as if it was a given that Beatrice was a part of them. One evening in May, while they were watching the sunset bleed all across the sky in shades of pink and orange, Beatrice turned to Ethan and said, "I reckon I'm ready." "Ready for what?" "Ready to be with you. Really be with you. Not because I feel I have to, not because I owe you a thing, but because I want to, because I love you." The words just hung there in the evening air, feeling precious and delicate. Ethan looked at her with pure wonder, like she had just handed him something more valuable than any gold. "Are you sure?" he asked. "There is no rush at all. I can wait as long as you need." "I am sure. I have never been more certain of anything in my whole life." Ethan got to his feet and held out his hand, and Beatrice took it. They walked into the cabin together, and for the very first time in her life, Beatrice knew intimacy as something truly beautiful. Ethan was patient and so gentle, always checking to make sure she was all right, letting her decide the way of things. And when she cried after, he just held her close and understood that they were tears of letting go, of mourning for all she had lost, and of joy for what she had finally found. "I love you too," he said into her hair. "I have loved you since that first day I saw you standing on that street, refusing to let them break your spirit. I will love you for the rest of my days." They were married in Fort Bridger on a bright June day in 1873, with a few friends from town to see it. Beatrice wore a simple blue dress she had stitched herself, and Ethan wore his Sunday best, which was worn and patched but clean as a whistle. The ceremony was quick and the get-together was small, but when Beatrice spoke her vows, she meant every last word. She was choosing this man, this life, and this future, and making that choice felt like she was finally taking ownership of herself. Their life together was not a simple one. The ranch was a demanding thing, and there were lean years when cattle prices fell or the weather turned mean. But they stood up to it all side by side, partners in the realest sense. Beatrice found out she had a sharp mind for the ranch's finances, keeping perfect records and making smart choices about when to buy and when to sell. Ethan found out that having someone to share the load made even the hardest days feel lighter. In the spring of 1875, Beatrice realized she was with child. The news filled her with a powerful mix of pure joy and deep-seated terror. She had never allowed herself to think she would have children. Never believed she would find a man she could trust enough to build a family with. But as her belly grew rounder and Ethan hovered over her with a fierce sort of care, she found herself looking forward to the future in a way she had never dared to before. Their son was born in December of 1875, a healthy little boy with Ethan's hazel eyes and Beatrice's own dark hair. They named him Samuel after Ethan's father, and Beatrice fell in love with her baby in a way that felt so strong it almost hurt. Holding Samuel, she understood in her gut what it meant to want to protect another soul, to give every piece of yourself to make sure they were safe and happy. Ethan was a natural father, taking his turn walking the floor with Samuel at night, changing diapers without a word of complaint, and talking to the baby in a low, soft voice that made Beatrice's heart swell. Watching him with their son, she could not help but think how different he was from every other man she had ever known. His strength was in his quiet gentleness. His power was in his kindness. 2 years later, in 1877, their daughter came along, a little girl they named Elizabeth after Ethan's sister Emily. She was a tiny copy of Beatrice, with the same blue eyes and determined little chin. Samuel was a loving older brother, carefully bringing his baby sister his toys and patting her head with all the enthusiasm a 2-year-old could manage. The Barrett Ranch grew bigger over the years, doing better and better as Ethan and Beatrice's hard work began to pay off. They hired men to help with the cattle, but they never forgot what it was like to have to scrape by. They paid a fair wage and treated their workers well, and because of that, they earned a fierce loyalty. In 1880, when Beatrice was 29 and Ethan was 34, They finally saved up enough money to build a bigger house, a real two-story home with separate bedrooms for the children and a kitchen that was not small and dark. But before the first nail was hammered, Ethan took Beatrice out to the spot where he had buried her collar 8 long years ago. "I want to build the new house to build. Right here," he told her. "Right on top of the place where we put the worst part of your past in the ground. That way, every single day when you walk through your home, you will literally be standing on the ground that means you are free and you made your own choice." Beatrice looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears. After 8 years of being married, he could still find ways to surprise her that showed how well he knew her heart. "That is just perfect," she said. "Let us build our future on that exact spot." The house went up that summer of 1880. It was a fine-looking place with big glass windows that let the sunlight pour in, and a wide porch that was just right for watching those dramatic Wyoming sunsets. The children ran all through the rooms, their laughter bouncing off the new walls, and Beatrice thought about the girl who had stood on a street in Fort Bridger wearing a collar, certain she had no future worth living for. That girl never could have dreamed of a life like this, a joy this deep or this powerful feeling of being right where she belonged. In 1883, they had another son, a solid little boy they named Thomas, who got his mother's stubborn streak and his father's patient soul. Their family felt whole. 3 children who would be raised knowing they were loved and wanted, who would never have to know the kind of powerlessness and shame their mother had been through. As the years went by, Beatrice became a well-respected woman in Fort Bridger and the ranches all around. She helped other women whenever she was able, offering a job to those who needed one and standing up to men who figured their money gave them the right to own somebody. She never spoke about her own past out loud, but folks knew the way folks in a small town always seemed to know things. And instead of looking down on her, they respected her for her backbone and for her refusal to be shaped by what had been done to her. Ethan's hair started to get flecks of gray at his temples in his late 30s, and Beatrice found her own silver threads in her early 30s. They would laugh about getting old together, about the lines that were showing up on their faces from all the years of hard work and good laughter. Samuel grew into a tall, serious young man who had his mind set on studying law. Elizabeth was smart and full of questions, always trying to figure out how things worked. Thomas was the rancher of the family, never happier than when he was out working with the horses and the cattle. In the summer of 1890, Samuel got on a train and headed back east for university, dead set on becoming a lawyer who fought for people who could not fight for themselves. Beatrice cried watching him go, but they were tears of pride. Her son was going to do good things in the world. He had been raised by 2 people who understood just how important justice and kindness were. Elizabeth left 4 years after that, on her way to a women's college in Colorado to study medicine. Thomas stayed on the ranch, taking on more of the day-to-day running of the place as Ethan's joints started to complain from decades of hard physical work. The ranch kept doing well, and in 1895, Thomas married a sensible young woman named Margaret, who loved the ranch life every bit as much as he did. Beatrice and Ethan became grandparents in 1896, when Thomas and Margaret had a little girl they named Rose. Holding her first grandchild, Beatrice thought about the impossible long road she had traveled from that awful day in Fort Bridger 24 years before. The baby girl in her arms was free, loved, wanted, and safe. That was her legacy. That was her victory. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1898 with all 3 of their children home, along with their families. Samuel had married another lawyer, and they had a set of twin boys. Elizabeth had found a good life with a doctor and had a little girl of her own. Thomas and Margaret were waiting on their second baby. The whole house just echoed with happy noise and laughter. 3 generations of Barretts were breathing life and love into every room. That evening, long after the rest of the family had turned in, and a peaceful quiet had settled over the house, Beatrice and Ethan sat together on that familiar old porch. She rested her head on his shoulder while his arm held her close, and they looked out over the land they had worked so hard to build. "Do you remember that day you cut this collar off me?" she asked softly. I remember every single second of it, Ethan said. I remember thinking you were the toughest soul I had ever seen, standing there scared to death but refusing to let it break you. I also remember thinking you were probably telling a tall tale that you would end up being just like all the others. What was it that made you decide to trust me? You buried that collar deep. You did not just toss it aside. You put it in the ground like it was some kind of evil that had to be buried for good. That is when I started to think you might really be a different kind of man. Ethan held her a little tighter. Best $100 I ever spent. I was never worth $100. You were worth every last thing I owned. You still are. They sat there in a comfortable quiet, watching the stars pop out one by one in that big Wyoming sky. Beatrice thought about the girl she used to be and the woman she was now. The road between those two people had been long and full of pain, but Lord, it had been worth it. She had made it through. She had healed up. She had loved a man and been loved right back. She had raised a family and created a legacy that would stand long after she was gone. The collar that Thaddeus Crane had fused around her neck was still buried somewhere under the foundation of their home, put deep into the Wyoming dirt where it could never bring harm to another soul. And every single day, Beatrice walked right over that spot, stood over that ugly symbol of her past, and lived a life that was not about what was done to her, but about what she decided to become. She had once been owned, but she had made herself free. She had been shattered, but she had put herself back together. She had been all alone, but she had found a true partner. And through every bit of it, Ethan Barrett had been right there by her side, not as her rescuer, but as her partner, not as her owner, but as her equal. He never demanded her love, but instead he earned it, day after day, year after year, with patience, kindness, and a steady, unwavering respect. "I love you," Beatrice said, and the words were just as true in 1898 as they were back in 1873 when she first dared to say them. "I love you too," Ethan answered, "for the rest of my days, and whatever comes next." And right there, on the porch of the house they built over buried chains, surrounded by the family they made and the life they chose, Beatrice Parker Barrett was finally and completely free. The cowboy had cut off her collar and put it deep in the ground. But the real gift he gave her was something much more precious. It was the chance to find out who she could be when she was no longer what other men had made her, and she had turned into someone truly special, not in spite of her scars, but because of them. Her past did not break her. It informed her, it shaped her, and in the end, she rose above it. Their love story was not about a man saving a woman. It was about partnership, about two people with their own hurts choosing to make something beautiful from the pieces. And as the stars wheeled across the Wyoming sky and the night grew still around them, Beatrice knew that this life, all of it, every happy moment, every hard struggle, and every victory, was exactly the one she would choose all over again. She had been someone's property, but she took herself back. She had worn a collar, but she had broken the chain. And when all was said and done, that kind of freedom, built on love and respect and a choice made by two people together, was worth more than all the gold in the whole territory. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.